In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to get started with Capture One Pro version 12. Hello and welcome, Michael Volshinovich here. You can find me via the social media links below and also on my website at vibrantshot.com. So in this tutorial, I'm going to recreate a video that I created quite some time ago, which was getting started with Capture One version 7, and quite a bit has changed since then, so I think it makes sense to record that video again and kind of take you through all of the different features that are available. Well, I shouldn't say all of the features because we would be here for quite some time, but I'll take you through as much as I feel you need to know in order to actually start working with Capture One and processing your raw files. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, before we actually start working on the images, we have to create a session or a catalog to house those images. And if you've worked with Lightroom, you're probably fairly familiar with the concept of catalogs, and the idea within Capture One is pretty similar. Now, sessions are a little bit different, and I will talk about both of them. In fact, I tend to work with sessions most often, but we're going to start off with a catalog here. So we're going to go into File, New Catalog, and we're going to create a catalog. Now, all you have to really do here is name it and give it a location. So as far as location, I do recommend using some sort of drive that is internal to your computer and is ideally a solid state drive. The faster access you have to it, the better, because the catalogs do get quite large, and so reading them will become a bit of a chore if you have them externally, and they may not always be available. So I do recommend trying to find some sort of internally stored location for those. So we'll just give our catalog a name here called temp catalog, and we're going to click OK. So that has created our new catalog for us, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to temporarily jump out of the catalog and also create a new session. So once again, we're going to go up to the top here, File, New Session, and here we're going to create a new session. So I'm going to call this one Temp Session, and once again, you have to specify a location for this. Now, you can place sessions pretty much anywhere. In fact, sessions are great for external media, and that's where I tend to use them. And you also get a bunch of different subfolders here that you can name however you'd like. So sessions are a little bit different in that everything is stored within the file system. So there isn't like a database file per se. Everything is kind of broken down into folders, which makes them very easy to manage using the Finder or Windows Explorer or something along those lines. So this is why here you see all of those options, but you didn't see them within the catalog, because within the catalog, everything is sort of dynamically built inside of a database. So I'm going to click OK, and that's going to create that one for us. So this is our session here. And what we want to do is, first thing I want to do is actually import some files into here, and then we're going to jump back into the catalog. So to import files, you can use this little down arrow over here, and we're going to select some files. So I've got some sort of source folder, but you can pick any folder here, just say choose folder. And you can select a folder that you want to import from. Obviously, that can be a CF card, an SD card. That's probably where it will come from. And destination, just kind of leave everything by default. Obviously, we want everything to go into the capture folder because the capture folder is generally where your raw files will reside. So there's other things that you can do in here. For example, one thing that I like to use a lot is the metadata. You can specify a copyright and a description for it. You can also specify how you want the naming to be done. So these are all kind of more advanced things, but I'm just mentioning them. And you can also go into adjustments and specify a style. So with Capture One, you can create styles or purchase styles. And one that I've created is called Import Default Black and White. And I do use that one quite often. Oftentimes when I import my files, I want to just see everything in black and white so that I can do my selections on a black and white image and not be distracted by color. And then once I have those selects, I remove the black and white and go from there. So it does basic adjustments like, fixing lens corrections, adding a little bit of clarity, adding a little bit of contrast. So you can set those styles up and then basically select them so that they're automatically applied as you're importing your files. And that's pretty much all you really need to worry about right now at this point. Once everything is set up, then we can click Import All, and that's going to import our files for us. And they're always going to be found inside of your capture folder in a session. So let's go out of this session now. We're going to actually go back into our catalog. So what we can do is I'm actually going to close this entirely, and we see in the file system that we've got two things here. So we've got temp catalog, which is the actual database file for the catalog, and we've got temp session. So temp session is actually the session that we just created, and we can see that directory structure. Again, going back to what we just kind of talked about when we were creating the session, we have all of these broken down folders. So capture is going to house all of those files that we just imported. And then within here, you are also going to have some additional files, some cache files and things of that nature. So don't worry about those. These are the actual raw files. They're housed in the root of the capture folder. And then output will contain all of your edited files. So if you're editing it in Photoshop as a TIFF or a PSD, those are going to find their way into the output folder. Selects don't kind of automatically populate. They populate whenever you drag things into select. So once you do your culling, you may want to move your selected files into the selects folder. I personally don't use that. I just use an album for my selects. And the trash folder is where you will find anything that you've deleted. So if you delete something in your capture folder, by default, Capture One will move it into the trash temporarily. And then of course you can empty that folder out. The catalog itself, as you can see, is self-contained. It is not a folder. It is just one file that is the catalog. So we're going to click on that, and we're going to open up that catalog that we created. So of course we can import images in the traditional sense, and we can also import them from a session. So I can go to File, Import Session, and I can actually import the session that I just created. So if we go into my media here, temp, and my temp session, I'm going to grab that one and I'm going to import it, and it's actually going to create a reference back to my temp session for me. So you can see that we've got those folders that we created within the session, and we've got the files from those sessions. Now what we can do is actually go into a file, and I'm going to quickly convert this one to black and white, for example, and add a little bit of contrast. Now what you'll notice is if I close this down, so I'm going to close the catalog, go back to the session. So you can open the session just by clicking on this the name.cosession.db file, and that's going to open up the session. And you're going to see that that same file is not affected. So it's actually sort of a separate version of that file. It's sort of a reference back to the original raw file, but the actual adjustment itself is stored within the catalog database. So it's not actually stored within the file itself. It's not attaching it to the session file. So this is sort of a reference-based linkage from the session into the catalog. Now going back to our catalog, once again, I'm going to close this down and we're going to go into our catalog. Now, one thing you may have noticed is that the size of the catalog increased pretty dramatically. It increased to 12.4 megabytes, even though theoretically we haven't actually imported anything into it because all of the files themselves, the raw files, are still in this capture folder. So even though the files are there, the catalog is growing in size simply because it's creating all of these preview and metadata files inside of that database. And so all of the previews themselves for each file, you know, your preview might be a megabyte or two, and that's actually being stored in there. And everything that you're operating on within that catalog is actually on that preview file. So even if you're importing by reference-based files, that catalog will still grow in size. Now what we can do alternatively is go into import, and I'm actually going to import the files themselves. So when you import into a catalog, you have two options. You can import to current location, and that basically means that the files will stay where they are, and it will create a reference to those files, which is kind of what we did with the session. Now, if your destination is inside the catalog, it will actually embed those files into the catalog itself, and then they will be sort of housed within that database. So there won't be separate files anywhere living within your file system. It'll just be those files housed within the database itself. So we're actually going to import inside the catalog. So I'm going to click Import All. And I personally, reference-based, you obviously don't want to use reference-based importing if you're importing from, let's say, a CF card, because then what it will do is the catalog will always assume that the location of the raw file itself is that location on your CF card, which most likely won't be the case because eventually you won't have that CF card plugged in or you'll format it. So you definitely don't want to use reference-based at that point. If you want to, you can, for example, take all of the files from your CF card, move them into some sort of an images folder on your drive, and then reference them into the catalog that way. Now, if you import directly into the catalog, what you'll see is that the catalog is getting quite large. We've already got 447 megabytes here, and all we've imported is these raw files here. So it's obviously going to grow quite rapidly, in fact. And so if you've got 100 megapixel files like you get out of a phase 1, or even 50 megapixel files out of something like a Sony A7, then you can eventually get into a very large catalog. And the problem with that is that without using the references, the catalog file will be massive, and if, heaven forbid, something happens to that catalog file and it becomes corrupt, all of your files are embedded directly within there, which is a little bit risky. The other problem with catalogs is that when I have sessions, I can have these sessions scattered across multiple drives. I can put them anywhere that I want. And all I need to do is use some sort of a backup manager like Carbon Copy Cloner to copy all of this stuff over from one drive to a copy drive, a backup drive. And then I've always got a copy. And every time I do that, I'm only copying what has changed. So if I've added something to the output folder, that one file is going to copy over. With a catalog, however, even if you want to make a copy of that, you're going to be copying the whole catalog every time, because every time you open the catalog and make one adjustment, that catalog file will change, and you'll need to back up what is potentially, a 1-2 terabyte file. And so that's kind of where you run into some problems. So you really have to decide. You really got three options, which is session, catalog with a database, or catalog with references. And personally, I always use sessions, but catalogs can be useful, in my opinion, in combination with sessions if you want to have your session as your working file and your catalog divided into something like a year or a genre. You can create separate catalogs for, let's say, 2018, 2019, and import all of your sessions or shoots that you did within that year into the catalog, and then have all of those in one place. So I hope that all makes sense in terms of sessions and catalogs. From now on, I'm actually going to jump into sessions only, and we're going to work off of sessions going forward, because the actual mechanics inside of Capture One are the same regardless of which one you're working with. The only things that will change is in this first tab here, you're going to have some different library options in terms of how these folders are structured. But a lot of things like albums, smart albums, they're the same in both catalogs and sessions. So let's talk about some of the different things that we do find in the library section over here. And some of the ones that I tend to use most often are found within the session albums section. And this is where you can create either albums or smart albums. And I find those both to be pretty useful. And what we can basically do is, with an album, it's just a traditional folder. So if we go into here and create an album, we can just name this My Faves, let's say. So we've got an album in here, and what we need to do to populate that is effectively just drag images in. So if I drag this image over here and I go into this album, we see that it is there. Now, the smart album, on the other hand, is a little bit different, because it actually allows us to specify certain criteria by which it will automatically populate those albums. So I can go into here, and if I, for example, mark this as yellow, this one as green, which is what I tend to use for my selects. You can also select those colors just by clicking over here. What we can do is create a smart album, and we're going to call this our selected. And for my presets, I've created a preset called selects. And that basically says that if my criteria is that the color selected is green or yellow, that will match. So we're going to click OK. And if we go into the selected, you can see that it's automatically populated by the images that are green or yellow from my capture folder. And that is kind of the difference between those two, is that one is manually populated and the other is automatically populated. And what you have here initially is the 5-star is actually a smart album as well. It is a smart album for anything that is rated over 5 stars. So if I click the number 5, click the number 5 on those first two, and I go into 5 stars, you can see that those are populated right there as well. So same idea, it's just an automatically created smart album for you. So those are some of the most common things that I tend to use here. You can obviously specify additional filters that you can manually build into here. And actually doing that in the capture folder is also possible. You can go into your search option, and within here you can define your search criteria. So all of those presets that I had are built into here, but there are obviously some defaults that are created for you. So the presets end up over here, and these ones are actually existing. So I can say if I want to see everything that is green, I can just select this and it will narrow it down. I can, for example, say I want to see anything that is green or 5 stars. So I can click plus here, and I can say where the rating is, for example, equal to, I guess with 5, let's do is greater than 4. So if I've rated it over 4, it's also going to include it. And what we need to do is match any. Because if I match all, then I'm basically saying that I will only show what is greater than 4 stars and is green. But if I want to see one or the other, I have to say match any of these. So it's basically saying if it's green or if it's 4 stars, or I can keep adding criteria if I'd like to. And I can also save this. If I like this preset, I can go save search preset, and that will save it for me, and it will be displayed in here. So now that I've got that one applied, you can see that it has selected everything for us. In this case, this one is rated 5 stars. That's why it's more than 4 stars. And these ones are rated green over here. This one is obviously both. but this one is green, doesn't have any stars, but you can see that they show up in here. If at any point you want to get rid of that filter, we can just click here, click on the X, and it will restore back the original list of contents from that particular session folder. Now, before getting into the images themselves, let's just take a look at the layout a little bit, just so that you understand where everything is placed within Capture One. Now, if at any point your workspace becomes a little bit wonky, you can actually restore it by just going to Workspace and Default. You can also save Workspace Layouts. So if there's a particular layout that you like to use for tethering, if there's a different one that you like to work with culling, or a different one for editing, you can create all of those different workspaces and kind of toggle between them. But if at any point things get kind of messed up for you, you can always go back to the default by selecting Workspace Default. Now, you can also select any of these other ones that are pre-created for you, and they're basically just going to kind of change the positioning of things and change some of the different options along the top here. Now, one thing that you can also do is if you're in your view here, some people like, for example, this is called the browser over here. Some people like to have that on the side. Some people like to have it on the bottom. So, for example, we can go into Browser, Customize Browser, and Place Below. And you can see that that's just going to put all of those images down at the bottom for you, and you can kind of toggle through them. This is kind of more that familiar Lightroom sort of view. And I personally like them, again, on the side, so I'm going to say place right. You can also, for example, customize the size, so you can decrease or increase thumbnail size. You can say that you want them large, and then we can kind of scale this up over here. And that's just going to kind of tell you how big your thumbnail is going to be. It's going to render some previews for those thumbnails. I personally tend to prefer them a little bit smaller, so we can go into View, Browser, and I'm just going to keep them as small. So let's go ahead and bring that back in. And you can do the same thing if we actually select this. There's a bunch of different options that you have for the toolbar. The toolbar is what you have along the top here. So we can customize toolbar, and we can specify what we want. You can see all of these different things kind of shaking around. We can place them elsewhere. We can add certain features. We can take certain features away. So you can just basically drag these guys up and down. So all of that, as you can see, can be heavily customized, and all of those customizations can be saved into a workspace. Over here on the left-hand side, we have the tools. So again, you can place that, for example, on the right, and then all of these things will swap over. I personally tend to prefer it on the left. And then you can also customize the actual viewer, which is this middle portion in here. So you can specify, how you want, like what you want displayed. Do you want the labels displayed? Do you want multi-view mode and things like that? So multi-view mode just allows you to select multiple ones at a time. So if we grab these two here and we go into View, Viewer, and we take off multi-view mode, you can see that's only going to show you the one. So I personally do always leave that on because it's nice to sometimes be able to compare two with one another. And if you want to compare them, you click on one, hold down the Command or Control key, click on another one. You can also click on as many as you want, and all of them will display within there. There is, of course, a limit to how much it will actually fit on the screen, but that is how you select multiple. You can also just grab the first one, hold down the Shift key, and select multiple by grabbing the last one. So all of that is pretty straightforward. And the only other thing that I want to mention in terms of the UI are all of these elements within the tools themselves. So this is where you're going to actually go to start doing some work on your images. And so there's a variety of different things in here. If there is anything that is missing along the top, you can always add it by right-clicking, and you can say Add Tool Tab. So this is actually called a Tool Tab. And anything that is gray is actually already added. Anything that is white is a tool tab that can be added. So local adjustments, for example, we'll add into here, and we have to actually stretch this out. And this is just the local adjustments tab, which personally you don't really need because all of those things sort of find their way into other places, other tabs. But you can also customize this by dragging things around. So if I want, for example, my curves, I can put them up in the top here. I can also go in here and remove the individual tools. So if I don't want white balance in here, I can remove it. I can also add back a tool. So I can go into here, say Add Tool, and I can select white balance, and then the white balance will pop up there. So at any point, if you lose a tool, you can always add it back, and you can always remove certain ones. So that, again, is all encompassed within the workspace, and you can customize that however you like. And we can remove this tool, for example. So if I don't want the local adjustments anymore, I can go into here and remove Tool Tab. Sorry, I got to remove Tool Tab, local adjustments, and yes, remove, and that will put that into here for us. So breaking down these individual tool tabs, The first one is what you would probably use if you were doing some sort of tethering. So if you've got your camera connected, and obviously Capture One is fantastic for tethering, so that can go into here. You can trigger your camera, get some additional information. It kind of depends on what kind of camera you have. Their support for different cameras is different depending on what it is. So certain features may be available, certain ones may not, but this is where tethered capture happens. Inside of this tab is your lens corrections, so it's basically where you'll fix, distortion, fringing. You can specify lens cast calibration over here if you're using, for example, a technical camera, and you can adjust certain things like keystone effects and whatnot. So all those kinds of adjustments, including rotation, flipping, that happens within the lens tab. Within this tab, this is generally the color editing tab, so all of your color related things find their way into here. So white balance, color balance, you can do black and white conversion. Of course, you can add and remove any of these options that you'd like. The color editor, also very helpful, and we will dive into that a little bit as well. And then this one is where you would go into all of your different exposure adjustments, so anything to do with sort of luminosities. We've got the high dynamic range, levels, curves, clarity, exposure. That's where you generally adjust your exposures. Once again, all of this stuff is, you can modify it. You can take different options out of here. You can put them into a different tab. So everything is really flexible. This one here is for sharpening, film grain, noise reduction, white ray removal. So that's kind of what you'd find in that one. Over here, we have our styles and presets, so you can create your own styles, your own presets. I've got a whole separate video on styles and presets, so check that out because it's a fairly large topic and it's far too much to cover in this particular video, so check that separate video out. Over here, we can do things like annotations, for example, so I can go in and say that I want to fix something within the hair, and I can just kind of select that and make a note of it, give that to my retoucher, whatever it might be. The retoucher in most cases is actually me, so I don't tend to use this, but certainly if you're on set and you're working tethered, and let's say that the creative director from the company has something that they want adjusted, they can automatically note that here. They don't have to wait for it to go into Photoshop. They can make a note of it so that you remember to fix it afterwards. Over here, we've got all of our process recipes. So this is where we actually configure how we're going to output these files. So we're going to output them, to a PSD, to Retouch, to a Jpeg, to a TIFF, whatever it might be. And we'll briefly touch on this as well. Within here, this is sort of the batch queue. So as we're processing things, that queue gets built up over here. Usually it's not something that you use too often, but if you're batch exporting, let's say 1,000 images to Jpeg, that queue will build up and it will take some time to get through. Then we've got some cropping options over here. So you probably saw this keystone stuff over in the lens section. And as I said, things will kind of duplicate as you go through these tabs, but this is the cropping tool. And you can see that this is where you would crop, rotate, and adjust keystone and things like that as well. And then the last one is the black and white tab, which allows you to convert to black and white and make some adjustments. Again, there's a lot of replication here. We've got exposure, curves, clarity, levels, vignetting, film grain. And those have just been kind of clustered in here because they're the common things that you would use when working with black and white. You probably won't use any color adjustments because generally speaking, you're working in black and white. So, you'll add grain oftentimes to a black and white image. So it makes sense that they're all clustered here. But as you can see, a lot of these options are available in multiple tabs and you can kind of place them wherever you'd like. Again, you can move things around. So if I want levels above exposure, I can drop it in there as well. So hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea of kind of where to go for all of these different things and sort of demystifies the actual UI for you. It is actually quite straightforward, even though there's a lot of options. Really, you just have to break down everything into your browser over here. This is your main viewport, and these are all the tools at your disposal. And of course, there's some additional metadata information scattered throughout. And with all of these different things, you can, go down here, you can click, you can rate things, you can rate them through here. And you can, of course, rate by selecting the image and using the number keys. So I've actually programmed the key 6 to be yellow, the key 7 to be green. So that's kind of my scale is going from basically 0 to 5 and then yellow and green. And you can, of course, modify those keyboard shortcuts however you'd like. And so now that we have a pretty good idea of how to get files into our session or catalog, where we can find different things within Capture One and also some of the tools that are at our disposal, let's go ahead and actually start using some of those tools to process our raw file and either get it ready for further editing in Photoshop or just get it ready for export right into a JPEG as a finished product. Now, one thing that has become sort of central to working within Capture One is this idea of layers, and that is one thing that has really evolved greatly since the last time I made this video in version 7. They didn't even have layers at the time, and now layers have really become central to everything. So it's important to gain an understanding of how they work in general. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because there is actually quite a lot of nuances to layers, and I have a separate video specifically on layers and masking and things of that nature, so I'll put a link to that video down in the description below, and you can kind of supplement that with what I'm just going to briefly show you here. So in this particular image, let's say I just want to affect this top portion where the water is. What I can do is create a new layer in here, and you'll notice that this layers panel is available pretty much anywhere. So if I go into colors, or if I go into the exposure section, I can see that the layers are available throughout, and they're actually going to be the same layer stack as you go through these different tabs. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new layer in here, and we're just going to call this one water. And what we'll do now is grab a brush, so you can hit the B key to convert that to a brush. And if you right click, you can actually change some of the brush properties. So you can adjust the size, for example. You can adjust the hardness. So if you want it to be very soft or a very hard brush, we're going to keep it at around 50%. And opacity and flow, again, things you're probably familiar with from something like Photoshop. Now, if you start brushing and you don't see anything, that is because you're not viewing the mask. So just hit the M key and that will actually display the mask itself. So let's go ahead and undo that just with Command-Control-Z. And I'm just going to go through here and start painting in this general area where our water is. So I'm just going to make a rough sort of selection around the subject here, and then down here, and just around the outside. Then what you can go ahead and do is in this little drop down, we're going to say fill mask, and that's going to kind of fill it in for us. And then we're going to click here once again and click on refine mask, and that's going to help you just kind of adjust this mask to something that is a little bit smoother and not quite as choppy as what we initially selected. And you can control sort of the size of the area that refinement is applied to. In this case, it seems like we're pretty good. If we go too far with it, then it starts to sort of blur it out too much, and it's not really what we want. So I think somewhere around 150 to 200 is going to be good in our case. Again, it oftentimes doesn't have to be perfect. So what we just want is a rough selection of this that doesn't really encroach on areas that we don't want it to come into. So once we are done with the mask, we're done selecting it, we can hit the M key to actually hide that because we don't longer want to see it. And let's go ahead and select our color tab, and perhaps we want to maybe warm up that water so that it is just a little bit more yellow, or we can cool it down further if we want to as well. So we can make that adjustment, and that adjustment is being made locally on that particular layer. If we select the background, for example, and we start working on that, you can see that we're affecting the whole image and not just that particular layer or that selection that we made. So that's something that we can do there. Now we can also create a mask in a variety of different ways. We can, for example, create a gradient instead of actually making that selection. We can just hit the G key and we get a gradient, and then we can apply that gradient sort of going across the top. And if we hit M, we can see where that mask is being applied, and we can sort of adjust it. Hit the M key, and again we can make an adjustment that way. So we can adjust this as we want to. Now obviously this is not nearly as accurate because we're sort of encroaching on the subject's face, but in some cases, if you've got a landscape shot and you just want to cut off at the horizon line, gradient works perfectly for that. If at any point you want to delete a particular layer, just hit the minus key and that will remove it. And there are different kinds of layers as well. So when we click on the plus key here in the drop down, we actually have an empty layer, we've got a filled layer, we've got a clone layer, and a healing layer. So you can actually create layers of different types. So these ones are actually the same thing. It's just by default, will a layer be empty or will it be filled entirely? And that can be useful as well if you've got a situation where you want to have everything filled in. So if I'm going to create a new filled layer here, that's going to be our layer 2, and I hit the M key, you can see that everything is filled right now, but I can start removing elements. So if I hit the E key for the eraser, I can go in and, for example, start removing the subject's face. So let's say I want to select everything except for the subject's face. It makes sense just to start off with a filled layer. Now you can also do that manually. So if we remove this, we have this layer 1, which if I hit the M key, it is not filled in right now. But if I go into this drop down and I say fill mask, it will fill it in as well. So regardless of whether you start with an empty one or a fill layer, you can kind of get to the same result just by filling it. Or you can also conversely clear the mask, which removes all of the selection within that layer as well. You can also create layers for healing and cloning and things of that nature. I'm not going to cover that because, again, that starts to kind of get into more advanced topics. And to be honest with you, I personally still do most of my healing and cloning inside of Photoshop. But if you run into a situation where you've got an image that is great, but there is one blemish that is just driving you crazy, or there's something in the background that you need removed, and outside of that, you don't need to go into Photoshop at all, it makes sense to remove it using some of these tools that are built in to Capture One instead of having to generate a PSD, go into Photoshop, and so on and so on. So hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea of what layers do in terms of how we mask them. The idea is really the same as masking inside of Photoshop, but once we have our layer, we can pretty much use any tool at our disposal. So I showed you, for example, in here adjusting white balance, but we can go into our exposure tab and we can adjust the exposure of that area as well. And if at any point you want to reset an adjustment, you can click on this button here and that will reset everything back. So everything that we see here, whether it's highlight recovery, whether it is shadow recovery, all of that can be used on a layer. And that was not always the case as layers progressed. There was, certain things you could do, certain things you can't. But now you can pretty much do anything on a layer with the exception of make it black and white. So you can, of course, at any point make it black and white by just taking all the saturation out of it. But you can't use the black and white conversion tool. So that is this one here. You can't use it on a layer, which is probably the reason why you don't see a layers panel within the black and white tab, but more or less anywhere else you will see it. Even in here, you can apply different elements onto a specific layer. So now that you understand how layers work, the main core layer is the background layer. So anytime you want to affect the image as a whole, you can do that on the background layer, but you can also do it on a new layer. So we can create a new layer in here called adjustment, or I'll just keep it adjust to keep it simple. And then we can say fill mask, and that's going to fill it. So as you can see, if we hit the M key, it's filled in, and we can just use that as our adjustment layer. So we can do all of our adjustments on this here. Let's say I want to darken this a little bit. I want to add a little bit of contrast, and I want to recover some highlights. I mean, this is obviously not necessarily what I want to do with this particular image, but I'm just showing you this as an example. And let's say I want to maybe make the highlights pop a little bit more, and I want to make the shadows less dark. So let's say I've made a bunch of adjustments here and I'm pretty happy with it, but maybe I've gone too far. What I can do now by having a separate layer for all of these adjustments is I can adjust the opacity of that layer by reducing the opacity over here. So that's the same as reducing the opacity in a Photoshop layer. We can control that and basically remove that effect. And this becomes very helpful when working with styles. Styles can be applied to a particular layer, and then we can actually reduce the effect of that style by adjusting that layer's opacity. So that is extremely helpful. And another feature that I do use quite often is this Luma Range feature, and that basically allows you to build a luminosity mask directly within Capture One. And it's really nice for selecting really bright highlights or really deep shadows, and if you want to kind of recover those in a specific area, you can actually automatically generate that mask based on the luminosity of a particular area. So that is more of an advanced topic, and again, it is covered in my layers and masking video, so I'll again link to that down below, but be sure to check that one out because it is a really powerful and useful tool to know. So now that we kind of have an understanding of layers, we're going to kind of leave them on the side for now because we're just going to work with the general tools on the background layer to make some adjustments to our images and actually get it ready for Photoshop and get it exported out into JPEG. Now, being that this is a getting started course, I'm not going to exhaustively go through every single tool that we have available to us because that would just take way too long, and this video I think is already getting quite long. So I will refer you to a tutorial that I did in the past on preparing your images for retouching in Photoshop, and I'll put a link to that in the description below as well. But we'll just kind of briefly go through some of the main ones that I think you'll use and kind of a general idea of how we use these tools here. So first thing I want to do with this particular image is just nudge the contrast, and I don't tend to use this contrast slider too much. I might add 1 or 2 points of contrast here, but never too much. It starts to get a little bit too heavy on brightening the highlights and darkening the shadows. So I tend to actually add contrast more through curves or levels. And then another thing that I want to do here immediately is go into the clarity. I do like the clarity slider a lot in Capture One, and it is actually, if you use the natural method, it is quite, as the name implies, natural, and you can push it to like 8 or 9 for a portrait or a fashion image. I wouldn't go too far on it because then it starts to look a little bit crunchy, but even up to 10 is probably okay. And then structure is really kind of just the finer details, so I'll kind of increase that a little bit. And one thing I like to do as well is add a little bit of contrast into the shadow. So what I do for that is I use this slider here. If you bring this in, you'll see that it's going to shift the whole sort of black point of the image over. You can kind of see the histogram nudging over to that side. So I do like to push that a little bit just to get a little deeper blacks in there. And you can also do that if you have really deep blacks. You can actually slide the top one and that will sort of wash them out a little bit if you want less contrast. You can also add contrast to the highlights in a similar manner just by sliding this one in, but we definitely don't want to do that here because the highlights are already pretty bright. The other thing I want to do, I think, is just reduce the exposure of this just a little bit because I think it's perhaps a tiny bit too bright, and maybe recover some highlight detail as well. So this is just highlight recovery, and conversely we have shadow recovery, which we won't use here because we can see that, you know, there's absolutely no shadows that are getting clipped here in the histogram. Everything is really pushed towards the highlight end of things. So I think as far as these adjustments go, that's pretty much all I want to do. You can, of course, use the curve to add a bit of an S-curve if you like contrast through curves. That's definitely an option for you. We might want to, for example, adjust some white balance here. That's obviously something that you'll do in almost every one of your images. So that's just in the color tab. You're going to see that we can slide around our white balance as needed. I personally actually rather like the white balance as is. So let's say we start playing with this a little bit here and maybe adjust it to something like this, and then we decide we don't want it. We can do one of two things. We can hold down the Option or Alt key and click down on that, and then when we release, it will kind of toggle back and forth as long as you're holding down the Option and Alt key. If you don't hold down Option or Alt and you click here, it'll simply revert the changes back to whatever the default value was when you started on your image for that particular tool. So this reverts back for the tool. And if you click on this one up top here, same idea, Option or Alt. If you click it, you'll kind of get a preview of reset all adjustments. And then when you release, it goes back. Or if you want to reset all of your adjustments fully, just don't hold down Option or Alt and just click it and it will revert back. So that is a few little changes there. And another thing I might want to do for this particular image is to crop it. So I'm going to crop to a 4x5 because maybe we want to put this on Instagram. We're going to hit the C key for the crop tool, and we're just going to drag from the bottom here and maybe grab something like that there. And you can, of course, rotate it as well if you'd like, something along those lines. So that kind of gives us a pretty good starting point for this particular image. Now, one thing I want to do actually is I wanted to show you one of these as well and look at some skin tone adjustments because that is a pretty popular tool within Capture One. So in the Colors tab, we have this color editor and we have a skin tone tab in here. And what you can basically do with this is select a particular skin tone that you like. So let's say we like this skin tone here. And using these uniformity tools here, we can actually make the hue match up to that particular tone. So let's say we start dragging this way, and we want to match up saturation. And this is really nice for, if you have patchy skin where, there's a mismatch perhaps between the neck and the face. It will try and kind of blend those together so that they're pretty close together, and you don't have to do all of those corrections inside of Photoshop. Now, one thing you may have noticed here as we did this, if we just toggle back and forth, is that we made the whole thing a little bit on the orange side. So I'm going to just slide the hue slider up here back a little bit to restore a little bit of magenta to it, and then maybe we can take out a little bit of saturation in the skin as well. Now, one thing that you'll notice as you do this, we are actually affecting the lip color. The lip color is usually like a pink or a peach or a red or something along those lines. And so it will kind of encroach into our selection of color because this is sort of the range that we have targeted. And so by using this slider, you can see again, if we toggle back and forth, that we are affecting that lip color. So once again, in my previous videos, I show you kind of how to do this, but using some of the layers and masking techniques that we've already covered, you have a pretty good idea that we would create a new fill layer and erase out this particular area here. So we would just actually apply this color editor to a new layer and remove the lips. And again, that's kind of beyond the scope of this video because I don't want it to take forever, but that is what I generally do when I'm using these skin tone tools is I make a selection of everything, but I exclude sort of the bits that I don't want, be it, clothing or lips or perhaps eye makeup. Those things can usually get excluded out. And again, if we toggle back and forth, we can see that that has kind of made the skin tones more even, more pleasing overall, and now we're sort of ready to bring that into Photoshop. But going back to the image we had, so let's just scroll down into here. To get it ready into Photoshop, we have to go into our Output tab here, and we have to actually set up a process recipe. So process recipes, as the name implies, are basically recipes for outputting your image in processing them into some sort of format. So that can be anything from a PSD to a TIFF to a JPEG, whatever you like. As you can see, I have a whole bunch predefined here, and you can create your own to your heart's content. But basically what you're going to do is click on the little plus icon here and give it a name. So we'll call it my output. And we can do something with this. So let's set up a format. So we can set up that we want to export it to a PNG or a PSD. Let's say we say that this is going to be our PSD output. And then we can specify a couple of things here. So do we want the resolution to be fixed? Do we want it, to be scaled down to a certain thing? We can set up, a width and height. We can set the long edge to a certain value. And in this case, our scale is fixed to 100%. Basically, we are not resizing it in any way. The next thing we can do is specify what it gets opened with. So you can open it with a particular version of Photoshop, and that is probably what you're going to do with a PSD or a TIFF file. Or, conversely, if it's a JPEG, you'll have different options in there. And then within the file, you can specify where it gets outputted to. Generally, the output location is your output folder. So as we kind of looked at when we were setting up our session, we had that output folder within there, and that's where it's going to go to. And you can also specify some adjustments here. You can specify a certain level of output sharpening and things of that nature. You can apply metadata to it, so you can copy certain metadata from your actual information over here. We can actually update the metadata for this particular image, add some copyright information, whatever it might be, and that will actually get appended to your file, which is great for JPEGs, for example. And you can also specify a watermark to be added. So again, if you're working with JPEGs and you want to add a watermark, or like a draft proof kind of notice or something like that, you can certainly do that here as well. So that's kind of the idea, and then once you're ready, just name it however you like, and if you want to use that process recipe, you just make sure that it is checked off. So as you can see here, we've got export JPEG. I've created this one is basically just a 3600px size file on the height, so it's going to limit my JPEG export size to 3600px, and we can specify a certain quality level for the JPEG, so on and so on, and all of the same output options are available in these tabs here. So if I wanted to export them into two different formats, I can select more than one process recipe. Now in this case, what I want to do with this particular image is I want to actually export it to a PSD file. So we're going to select PSD 8-bit, and that is where we're going to export it to, and just make sure that there's nothing else checked off. And so once we've got that recipe defined, these are not available by default. This is something you have to create. So this one here, I just made sure that it is 8-bit, and I have another one here that you can see is a 16-bit, depending on what I need in my particular case. So let's go ahead and actually process that using that recipe there. So we're just going to hit process, and it's going to load the image into Photoshop. So we've got our PSD file now, and we can do with this whatever we'd like. For example, let's imagine that we're going to do some cropping here. So let's say we want to kind of enlarge the background. So we're going to do some content aware work here, whatever it might be. Content aware fill. This may or may not work. We'll see. Let's say we're happy with that. We've done the rest of our retouch. We can save that up, and then we're going to go back into Capture One. And we can go into our folders here, and in our output folder, we are going to see our new image. So this is the actual image that we worked on inside of Photoshop. And that is really nice, actually, to have all of that in here, because this sort of round trip is really great for then exporting your image to whatever format you'd like. And I tend to use this almost exclusively now. I used to actually do the export to JPEG out of Photoshop, but that is certainly actually a waste of time, because it's really nice to have all of your finished images in here. You kind of give them one last once over, make sure that the overall color grading is the same, that they feel the same, their sort of overall tonality, and any adjustments that you need to make, you can always do that on top of the actual PSD file here. So what I've done, for example, is define some styles in here where I've got user styles and I've got JPEG output, and it's going to add some contrast for me. So I'm not sure if we can see this because it's super subtle, but it's basically adding a little bit of extra contrast to my image for export, and it's adding things like noise. So I've got some film grain. I shouldn't say noise, it is actually film grain, and the film grain inside of Capture One is really nice, and that film grain was sort of, the amount is suited well to exporting for 3600 pixel size images. And I did that using the proofing tool. So you can actually create proofs of certain resolutions and kind of see how all of these levels of grain and sharpening will actually look on your desired output proof. That again, beyond the scope of this particular tutorial, but you can take a look at proofing inside of Capture One, and that will give you an idea of what that does. So now that I've got this version, let's say I want to also have a black and white version. What I can do to actually facilitate that really easily through Capture One is just right click there, and we're going to select that we want a new variant. So we're going to select up here, new variant, and that is actually going to copy everything over. So I've got basically a duplicate copy of this, and note that it is not copying the actual PSD. It's just copying sort of the metadata information attached to that particular file. So the PSD is still just one copy, but we've got multiple variants of that particular image. So I can now go into here, and let's say I want to apply my black and white. So I've got some styles here, and I want to apply this black and white portrait style to it. And now I've got my color version and my black and white version, and I can select, for example, both of these, go into my process recipes, and I can go down, take the PSD off, and I can select output to JPEG that I want 3600px on the long edge, hit process, and it's going to convert both of these images into a JPEG at 3600px. So that's kind of that workflow, how it works from start to finish. So I will do the adjustment to the raw file in here, bring it to Photoshop, do the retouch there, and then back out of the output section, I will do any sort of final tweaks to the images. Now you can also do, for example, what I'll sometimes do is just give it a skin retouch inside of Photoshop and then do the actual color grading inside of Capture One. That way I can just apply color grading en masse to, let's say, 20 images. I select them all, apply the same style to all of them, or, apply a style to the first one and then copy over. And actually, let me show you that before we sort of wrap up here, how you can actually copy styles from one to the next, because I think that is something that I do use quite often. So let's go ahead and just select the first one only. And I'm going to say new variant. And if you're curious actually what the difference is between new variant and clone variant, with clone variant, you're actually going to make a copy of that image along with any adjustments that have been applied, whereas new variant just makes a copy of the base image without the adjustments. So let's go ahead and say new variant without any adjustments, and we can kind of see the difference between these two. You can see that the first one is a little bit brighter, it's got more contrast than the second one. So if I want to actually copy those adjustments over, now obviously I could have just said clone variant and it would have done that automatically, but I wanted to show you how to kind of do this manually. So we're going to click on this little up arrow, and then we're going to select our destination image, and we're going to click on this down arrow here, and that's actually going to copy it over, and you can see that they're both now the same. What we can also do, again, let's just revert everything from here, is we can select multiple images. So let's go ahead and select all three of those, and clicking on the pointer, make sure that your first one is selected. So this is the one we actually want to use as our source. And we can go into adjustments, copy and apply adjustments. And from here, we can specify what actual adjustments are going to be copied over to our images. So let's say we decide that we don't want to apply the levels adjustment across all three of these. We want to apply, for example, just what do we have here? We've got grain and clarity. So we want to actually apply that one to all the subsequent images. So I'm going to click apply, and that is going to copy everything over, with the exception, of course, of the levels adjustment, because we deselected that one. So that is a useful tool when you've got a whole bunch of adjustments and you've decided that, I want to copy, for example, all of the white balance, and I don't want to copy the other stuff. So you deselect everything, but you just check off white balance, and it will apply it across your entire selection of images. So hopefully you found that lesson useful. I know we covered a whole lot of information, but I really wanted to make sure that we cover everything from sort of start to finish, getting images into your session or catalog, making a few basic adjustments, getting it into Photoshop, getting it back into Capture One, and then doing the final output to something like a JPEG or a PNG or whatever it might be. And if you did find that useful, be sure to subscribe to my channel so that you get future updates just like this one, and we will see you next time. Bye for now.